Well, this time last year, I was planning to do this seminar. I was all set to go, and then COVID hit. And our spring Presbytery plans last year were radically different than anticipated. We were not able to have the seminar like we usually do, and so it was put off for a year. And the past year has been a year of stretching and growing, I think, for all of us. It's forced us to evaluate and reevaluate many different things in our lives. It's changed ministry in some significant ways that cannot be easily forgotten. So in some sense, I'm really thankful for this past year and for this experience with the COVID crisis because of all that the Lord has taught me, and especially when it comes to honoring our elderly relatives. This past year has also been educational in terms of my own parents, Norm and Wilma DeYoung. It's been a really eventful year for my mom and dad. And I have greatly appreciated all the members of Presbytery who have been praying consistently for my folks. They've experienced some significant decline, and that has given me some practical experience in going from theory to reality. And so I think I see things very much differently and perhaps more clearly. So it's my hope that the COVID edition of our seminar tonight is going to be a better seminar, a clearer, sharper, more focused, more practical seminar. So I want to begin with a few questions to get you warmed up a little bit. And please don't overthink these questions. First of all, would you please raise your hand if you have parents? Some of you don't have parents. We all have parents. Some of our parents may be gone to be home with the Lord. Some of them may still be living. But we all have parents. And those people are very important in our lives. Raise your hand if one or both of your parents are needy, if they need your help on a regular basis. Raise your hand if you are near enough geographically to spend regular time with your elderly parents. Now, some of us live a significant distance from our elderly parents. And that becomes a factor. We're not able to stop in and check on how they're doing. My mother-in-law lives 8.5 hours south of us, down in southern Illinois. We can't see her very often. We just don't get down there all that much. And when there's a geographical distance, that's a factor that changes the equation significantly. Now, in a little different direction, I want you to raise your hand if you have members in your church who are caring for aging relatives. Raise your hand if you have members who have an elderly parent who is living in their home. Raise your hand if you have members in your church whose parents are suffering from dementia. Raise your hand if you have 5 or more member families in your church who are caring for aging relatives. So 5 or more member families caring for aging relatives. And then one last one, and this is especially for pastors. Raise your hand if you have counseled any members of your church who are caring for their aging relatives. You've been engaged in counseling with them. The point is this: most every church is dealing with this. some more, some less. This is not a small problem that touches maybe one or two congregations now and then. This is an ongoing issue that challenges almost every church. In our church in Sheboygan, we've had 10, 15, 20 different member families at different points who have cared for aging relatives. We've had numbers of family members of our members who are dealing with Alzheimer's or dementia. And so this is not a small issue, it's not an insignificant problem. Part of the reason for this is because life expectancy has been going up and up and up. Now, I heard recently that COVID has taken it down a little bit, but it is still quite elevated over what it was 20, 30, 40 years ago. And with the increasing life expectancy, which is generally a good thing, come some difficulties, problems, and challenges that were maybe not faced so often by previous generations. And so this particular issue is something which particularly impacts our day and age, and something that the church needs to think about for our ministry in this current time. Well, with my time this evening, I want to first of all concentrate on the responsibility of individual Christians to honor their elderly parents and all that that entails. I want to look at some scripture. I want to think about different facets of caring for the aging, and then leave some time at the end of the first session for questions. Then we're going to take a break, and then in our second hour, I want to look at the duty of the church as the church, and to think about how we engage in ministry to the elderly and to their families. So first hour is individual responsibilities, second hour is the church. Well, I want to begin with a quote from Charles Bridges, who's always good to quote. Charles Bridges says, "The disciple of the Bible will own himself to be a child in relative obligations long after he has ceased to be a child in years. Neither age nor rank gives any claim for exemption." So if you're a disciple of the Bible, you will remember always that you are a child and you have relative obligations, even when you're an adult, even when you're an older adult. And so neither age nor rank exempts you from this. Well, let's begin with a brief biblical foundation. As we think about this issue of ministry, we want to think in biblical terms first and foremost. And my starting point is the Fifth Commandment. This is found in Exodus chapter 5, verse 12. Exodus 20, verse 12. "Honor your father and your mother, that your days may be prolonged in the land which the Lord your God will give you." Now, this is a familiar commandment. We're all very well versed in this commandment. But I think sometimes we look at this as a commandment for tiny children. Children like my 2-year-old grandson, James. James, honor your father and mother, because tiny children need to obey this commandment. But you know, this commandment is not exclusive to young children. It's not limited to the little ones. It applies to children of all ages, including adult children. It is something that each Christian must be concerned about, even if they are in their adult years. Now, the verb that is used here in the Hebrew, kaved, means to honor. to treat with respect. The term kavod or kavod has the idea of being weighty. And so you should treat someone as weighty. You should recognize their dignity and you should treat them accordingly because this is their due. You don't look at your parents and treat them as light and unimportant and insignificant. You treat them with the full weight of who and what they are. This command is for both parents, and that is explicit and specific. It is for father and for mother. Not just the favored parent, but each parent. And each parent regardless of whether or not they are a good parent, a favored parent. Now, sometimes we run into families where there is obviously one spouse who is an exceptional, godly individual, and the other spouse who's really not. And we can be tempted to say, well, I'll honor the godly one, the respectable one, but that other one who is always saying those harsh and difficult things, well, they don't deserve honor because they don't act respectable. But the command is, regardless, honor your father and mother. And if they're both great, faithful, godly people, well, wonderful, honor them for that. But even if they're not, even if they do sinful things, you still have a duty to honor and respect and revere them. There is a promise attached to this commandment, the promise of a long and happy life for those who honor their parents. But this promise is not for those who dishonor, who disregard, who ignore, or who neglect their parents. And I think that's especially true in later years. And so the promise, which Paul makes much of, is a significant promise of blessing, prosperity, happiness, long life in the land. But you can't claim that promise if you don't honor your parents. Now, our larger catechism treats the duties required in the Fifth Commandment in question and answer 127, and I find this one particularly helpful. The question is, what is the honor that inferiors owe to their superiors? So this is talking about children, even adult children, toward their parents. Any inferior toward a superior. The answer is, the honor which inferiors owe to their superiors is all due reverence in heart, word, and behavior, prayer and thanksgiving for them, imitation of their virtues and graces, willing obedience to their lawful commands and counsels, due submission to their corrections, fidelity to defense and maintenance of their persons and authority according to their several ranks and the nature of their places, bearing with their infirmities, covering them in love, so that they may be an honor to them and to their government. Now let's make that very practical and personal. We as adult children have a duty to give all due reverence to mom and dad in heart, in word, and behavior. Our attitudes, our speech, and our conduct. all due reverence. We have a duty to pray for and give thanks for our parents. Prayer and thanksgiving for your mom and your dad. Imitation of their virtues and graces. Examining their lives and saying, you know what, there's some things I really appreciate about my dad. And I want to imitate him in his virtues and in his graces. Now, I'm sure as my own children look at me, they see plenty of things that they don't want to imitate and shouldn't imitate. I'm a sinner, so are you. And in those ways, we don't imitate our parents in their bad habits, their sinful inclinations, but even the worst parent has some virtues. Even the most dysfunctional parent has some graces that we can look to and appreciate and imitate. We should give willing obedience to their lawful commands and counsels. Now, when you're a child and you're still under your parents' roof, you have to obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. When you're an adult and you're living in your own household, you're no longer under your parents' direct authority because you're in a new covenant household. But your parents can still give you counsel, can still advise you, can still help you with perspective. And it's just no good to say, you know what, Dad, I don't want to hear it. If I want your advice, I'll ask for it. My own father gave me some very wise advice about 6 months ago, and I so appreciated it because it was something I hadn't thought of at all. And he just kind of dropped this nugget out, and I was like, wow, thank you. You just saved me a whole bunch of struggle and trouble by giving me that advice. To have an open ear to the wisdom and advice of your parents. Due submission to their corrections. Sometimes elderly parents have to rebuke their children for waywardness, for bad choices, for sinful decisions. And just as we would in any situation, we're always listening to the loving rebukes of those who are wiser, older, more mature than we are. And so being willing to be humble with your parent and listen to corrections they might give you. This next one is especially significant. Fidelity to defense and maintenance of their persons and authority according to their several ranks and the nature of their places. As parents age and become enfeebled, they need help. They need defense. They need maintenance of their persons. And that can take some very practical, tangible forms to show that kind of loving care for them. Bearing with their infirmities, covering them in love, so that they may be an honor to them and to their government. Sure, parents make mistakes. Sure, parents do things that are shameful, and sometimes we have to cover over their infirmities. But we do so in love, and we do it so that they will be honorable, even though they might be doing dishonorable things. As we look at the scriptures, we not only find clear commands like the Fifth Commandment, but we also find biblical examples. And the biblical examples can often give us a real-life picture of how the command looks in practice. So where we have examples, we compare the examples to the clear commands, and we let the examples and the commands kind of work together. So as we think about the scriptures, we look for some biblical examples of children caring for their aging parents. One example, which I think is historically important and significant is what happened after the flood with Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. As you remember, Noah, after the flood was over, planted a vineyard, and Noah made some wine. And with the wine from his vineyard, Noah got drunk, and he was laying uncovered in his tent, naked. Just think about that. How would you feel if you went by to visit your parents and you saw your dad laying naked on the sofa with a bottle of wine next to him? Oh my, what has happened here? But the key to this example are the different responses that are given. Ham sees it, and he goes out and he reports to his brother what he has just witnessed. Dad's in there, he's smashed, and he's naked. He's dishonoring his father. Shem and Japheth, on the other hand, took care to cover over their father's infirmities. They literally put a robe over their shoulders and they backed into the tent, and then without looking, they threw the robe back over Noah so that at least he was covered while he lay there in his stupor. They honored him. Now, it says that when Noah woke up and found out what his son Ham had done to him, he was angry. We don't know what he did to his father, but at the very least, we know that he dishonored his father by making him a jest, a joke. And so because of that, Ham's descendants are cursed through the generations. Canaan is made a slave of the others. Meanwhile, Shem and Japheth are blessed by the Lord because they honored their parent in his infirmity. And so here is a practical example of one brother who dishonors and pays a heavy price, and another brother, two other brothers, who honor their father and are greatly blessed of God for doing so. Another example from the book of Genesis is Joseph and Jacob. And this is especially at the end of Jacob's life, when Joseph is the prime minister of Egypt, and Jacob comes down to Egypt, and there's that beautiful reunion where Joseph goes to his father and embraces his father and weeps on his neck. And you just see the love of Joseph toward his father Jacob. And then Joseph takes care of Jacob for the remainder of his life. He introduces him to Pharaoh. He provides a good place for Jacob and his children and grandchildren to live and flourish. He feeds them during that horrible famine that racked the land. And so Joseph, who is one of my favorite Bible characters to start with, really shows us what love for an aging parent looks like. And then another Old Testament example is Ruth and Naomi. If you think about Ruth and how she cares for Naomi, Naomi is she's kind of a whiner. She's a complainer. She sees everything in the darkest possible tones. And Ruth is like a daughter to her. And Ruth is caring for her. And at the end of the book, you see Naomi, who has been bitterness, now brought the joy of having this baby upon her lap. And so Ruth is another example of someone who cares lovingly for an aging mother-in-law. Well, then we want to turn also to the New Testament. And I'd like to spend some time on one particular passage. If you have a Bible, turn to 1 Timothy chapter 5. I think this is one of the most important and most specific passages in the Scriptures dealing with these very issues. And I want to read from verse 1 through verse 16, because the whole passage really revolves around these themes. Do not sharply rebuke an older man, but rather appeal to him as a father, and to the younger men as brothers, the older women as mothers, and the younger women as sisters in all purity. Honor widows who are widows indeed. But if any widow has children or grandchildren, they must first learn to practice piety in regard to their own family, and to make some return to their parents, for this is acceptable in the sight of God. Now she who is a widow indeed, and who has been left alone, has fixed her hope on God, and continues in entreaties and prayers night and day. But she who gives herself to wanton pleasure is dead even while she lives. Prescribe these things as well, so that they may be above reproach. But if anyone does not provide for his own, and especially for those of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. A widow is to be put on the list only if she is not less than 60 years old, having been the wife of one man, having a reputation for good works, and if she has brought up children, if she has shown hospitality to strangers, if she has washed the saints' feet, if she has assisted those in distress, and if she has devoted herself to every good work. But refuse to put younger widows on the list, for when they feel sensual desires in disregard of Christ, they want to get married, thus incurring condemnation, because they have set aside their previous pledge. At the same time, they also learn to be idle as they go around from house to house, and not merely idle, but also gossips and busybodies, talking about things not proper to mention. Therefore, I want younger widows to get married, to bear children, keep house, and give the enemy no occasion for reproach. For some have already turned aside to follow Satan. If any woman who is a believer has dependent widows, she must assist them, and the church must not be burdened, so that it may assist those who are widows indeed. Well, look at a couple of the verses in particular. First of all, look at verse 4 here. But if any widow has children or grandchildren, they must first learn to practice piety in regard to their own family, and to make some return to their parents, for this is acceptable in the sight of God. This tells us that children and grandchildren of widows have a direct and specific duty to their mother or their grandmother. So this is a very narrow focus. If you have a grandmother or a mother who is a widow, you have a duty to them. And the duty is to practice piety or practice godliness in regard to your own family. So as you think about your widow mother or your widow grandmother, you need to behave in a godly, Christ-like fashion toward that widow. The Greek term that is used here means to be devout, to show piety, to respect, and to show support. And so you need to respect, love, support, care for that widowed mother or grandmother in a godly, pious, devout way. So this is a Christian duty of godly children and grandchildren to their elderly loved one. One of our elders had a mother first and then a father who declined and then died. And both of these grandparents, the father and the mother, were unbelievers, and frankly, they were sort of difficult people. Both of them suffered dementia, and especially the father or the grandfather became very caustic and hard to get along with. And I was so encouraged to see not only my elder, but his wife and their children going over, spending time with Grandpa and Grandma, doing things for them, cutting the lawn, washing the sheets, cleaning the house. And sometimes, especially in the later stages of the father's dementia, he became very abusive. And it was harder and harder to go there and to spend time trying to help them because you'd get cursed at. But these people just kept going because they knew they had a duty. And it wasn't just the elder and his wife, but their children who were the grandchildren. Grandchildren also are specified here. Also here in verse 4, we see the fact that they are to make some return to their parents. And the idea behind this is paying back what is due. Your parents have done lots for you. They have cared for you. They have loved you. They changed your diapers when you were a baby. They cleaned up the skinned knee and put a Band-Aid on when you fell down. They comforted you when you were sad. And because of the investment parents make in their children, children need to pay the debt back later on in life. Because later on, things are changed, aren't they? Now it's the parents who can't fend for themselves, the parents who need that kind of tangible care. And now the adult children have a debt to pay, and they need to render back to their parents in return for what their parents have done for them. Well, the last thing that this verse says is that this kind of pious and loving care is acceptable in the sight of God. God loves this. He delights to see it. Well, then go on to verse 8, because verse 8 is another important one. But if anyone does not provide for his own, and especially for those of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. Now let that sink in. If you do not care for your own, especially for those of your own household, you have denied the faith and are worse than an unbeliever. This reminds us of James' statement in James 1:27. Pure and undefiled religion in the sight of our God and Father is this, to visit orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself unstained by the world. To visit orphans and widows in their distress is part and parcel of pure and undefiled religion in the sight of our God. And if you refuse to care for your own aging relatives, you are worse than an unbeliever. You've denied the faith. That's really strong. It's shocking. Now, this idea of being worse than an unbeliever can be taken in different ways, but what I think this means is that even unbelievers know that they should take care of their aging loved ones. There are common grace insights that unbelievers have that say, when my parents are infirmed, I need to be there to help them. When I was doing research for my book, I was looking for Christian resources on this topic, and I looked in vain. There weren't any books that were addressing the Christian duty to care for your aging relatives. But what I did find is this: the world has a lot to say about this, and the world is not that wrong on many of these things. And yes, they come from a psychological bent. Yes, they have different assumptions and priorities, but even unbelievers see that the aging need care, and that care should often come from their adult children. So if even unbelievers do this out of these common grace insights, what are we to think of a professing believer that says, I refuse to see my parents, I refuse to help them, I'm too busy, I have no time for it? It is a practical denial of the faith. And it is a way of saying, I'm not even going to live by the standard that my unbelieving pagan neighbor lives by, because I'm somehow exempt as a Christian. I have a right to be enormously selfish as a Christian. You see, Christians of all people should be the ones who say, you know what, we have a duty to these people who have loved and sacrificed for us all these years. And as Christians, we're going to pay them back what is due to them. And I wouldn't think of not caring for my elderly parents. And yet we find sometimes in the church there are those who will just simply disregard this and say, look, I'm just too busy. I don't have time. It's not a priority. I've hired someone to take care of that for me. Well, let me talk a little bit about some practical realities that come out of the biblical content. And the first one is this: you simply cannot blithely ignore your aging parents. To do so is a serious sin that even unbelievers don't commonly engage in. It's not just a tertiary matter that's optional. Take it or leave it. This is a matter of duty, and to neglect it is sin. Second, you have an obligation to make a return to your parents for all that they have sacrificed to you when you were a little child. You owe them a debt. Pay the debt. And when you think about that, it changes how you care for them, because you're not thinking, well, I'm doing some great favor to them, and they better be really thankful. But rather, I'm paying a debt that I have long owed, and it's past time for me to pay it off. And I'm not looking for a pat on the back. I'm not looking for people to say, that was really great. I am just doing the lowest obligation, and I expect no praise or applause for doing that. When you pay a debt, let's say your electric bill comes, and you write out the check and you send it off in the mail, do you expect to receive a letter of congratulations and thanks from the electric company? Oh, you're such a wonderful person for paying your bill. No, they said, well, it's about time. So paying a debt because we owe it. The next thing I want to say is bold and strong, but I'll say it anyway. Warehousing your parents by shipping them off to an institution so that you can forget them is exceedingly wicked. Now, that's not to say that there's never a place for nursing homes or care facilities. There are times when those places are very necessary, and where they offer a level of care and have expertise that you simply don't have in the home. So don't interpret this to say, oh, he's against nursing homes. That's not the point. I'm talking about warehousing. As if you can put your parent in a crate and a forklift will put them on some shelf in the warehouse so that you can go your way and forget about them. That's a great evil. And in our society, there is an evil tendency to warehouse the elderly, to promptly forget them, to sinfully neglect them, and to leave them in institutions to die. Before COVID, I enjoyed going to nursing homes and hospitals to do ministry there. And I am looking to the day when we can go back and do nursing home ministry again. I think it's a very important area of ministry. But as I went to nursing homes and as we conducted worship services there and as we talked with the residents, so often they had no family. Nobody ever visited them. They were put in this institution, forgotten, and left to die. And COVID has made this far worse. Because now you can't even go in if you want to visit them. You're forbidden. And then there's the fact that in some places in our country, state officials have sent COVID-infected patients back into their nursing homes so that the nursing homes became hotbeds of COVID infestation, and many, many people died of COVID because the elderly are so vulnerable to this. And so, yes, sometimes we need to use nursing homes. Sometimes care facilities are the best and sometimes the only option. But don't warehouse those dear people. Another thing, which is in a different direction, you're a fool if you try to do it all on your own. This task is far too much for any single person to shoulder by themselves. You really need a team of helpers. And this is simply good Presbyterianism applied to this particular situation. You have different people who contribute different strengths, different capacities, different abilities, and they come together as a team to help care for a loved one. The team can include a medical professional. It can include other family members. It can include pastors or church leaders. It can include financial planners, possibly even lawyers and accountants. Different sorts of people coming together with these different expertise to serve that person and their needs. You also need the prayer and support of your church throughout this whole experience. We have watched in several different situations in our congregation as aging parents have declined, as they've suffered from dementia, as they've become incapacitated, as they've declined toward death and died. And in those situations, the prayer and support of the church for the adult children is so very vital. And lots of times there's so many things that just demand time, energy, and attention that you say, well, I've got my hands so full of all that I'm trying to do that I don't have time for church. But you see, the church is there to be a support agency to give the help, the care, the love, the prayer, the encouragement that anyone needs in this mammoth undertaking. And so remembering the place of the church in the life of the adult children and in the lives of the aging parents. Furthermore, you need fellowship and support from other Christians who have been through this sort of an ordeal before. And you need their experience to guide you and instruct you. Another one of my elders and his wife dealt with her mom who had dementia and who got to the point where mom didn't recognize Bob and Debbie anymore. And for years this went on. And Bob and Debbie would go and visit her, and she didn't know who they were. And they would try their best to engage with her. And it got to the point where she basically was not communicating at all, and yet still they went. Well, she died, and their life kind of returned to some normalcy after that. And as they processed that whole experience over a decade or more, they had a wealth of practical, personal knowledge that they could then share with other members of the church who were going through similar situations. And it was so helpful for some of these folks who were in the very beginning stages of this to hear Bob and Debbie say, well, here's what happened to us. Here's what happened at this point and that point. Here's what we did. Here was a hard decision we had to make. And so the fellowship and encouragement of your fellow Christians is really going to help you as you go through the really difficult challenges that you could face. And then one last thing, and this is what I'm calling a COVID insight. I had this moment, I don't know when this happened, maybe June or July, or maybe it was even May. And I don't even remember where it happened, but all of a sudden this light went on my head. And I said to myself, you know what? One of the things that congregations do is congregate. What is congregating? It's meeting together. And the more I thought about that, and the more I kind of watched COVID and the restrictions and everything in our church, the more I came to appreciate the vital importance of being present with each other in the flesh. Now, Zoom and all the other wannabes have some value, no doubt, and they do provide a service. We're going to use that service tomorrow at Presbytery, as many of our presbyters will not be here in person. They'll watch on Zoom and participate through Zoom. You know, it's got a place, but there's just nothing quite like being together in the flesh, in person, present among each other. And I don't want to build this into a great new theological system, but I do think that there is something deeply important about physical presence and how that impacts people. And part of the reason that I say that is because our Lord Jesus Christ left his heavenly glory, took on our flesh, and dwelt among us as a man among men. He was with us. He is God with us, Emmanuel. And that sense of being present, being with other people, has a very important value that we cannot ignore or dismiss. And again, this is one of the reasons why I continue to be really flummoxed with some of these restrictions, where they say that you can't go visit your elderly family who are in a nursing home. And I'm sorry, window visits, talking through screens. It's just not the same. There's something about human touch that is extremely valuable. And when people are deprived of human touch, it does something very bad to them. It hurts them in ways that are hard to describe, but you can see the effects. This past weekend, we were out in Reno, Nevada, visiting our new grandson, Frederick Gene DeYoung, quite a young man. And at one point, he was kind of squalling, so I wrapped him up in his blanket and held him on my chest, and he fell asleep on my chest. And he just slept there for a long time. And talk about a happy grandpa. Having my grandson laying on my chest asleep was such a beautiful experience. Yeah, we'd seen pictures, we'd done video chats, all that stuff, but there was nothing like being there and being in connection with them physically. Now, I prepared for you a handout, which is on the back table as you go down the steps there, with some various categories of practical considerations. And I'm not going to run through these right now. I'm just alerting you to these. Appreciating the stages of life, health and well-being, dealing with dementia, financial issues, strained relationships, juggling and burnout, funerals, and beyond. And in part, that is just simply an outline of my book. It gives you an idea of some of the things that I cover in the various chapters of the book. And so at this point, let me do the shameless promotion. I put this book together in the form that it is, specifically for churches. For individuals too, but for churches to use. Each chapter is fairly short, fairly readable, and it has discussion questions at the end. And the idea is you read it, you get together in an adult Sunday school class, you discuss it. And it goes through these various things. Now, you might be wondering to yourself, what does Brian DeYoung know about financial issues? Well, not much, but I have a brother. And my brother knows a lot about financial issues. So the ghostwriter for that chapter was Greg DeYoung. And so through various different contributors, I've tried to deal with a number of these different things. The area of Alzheimer's and dementia. I got tremendous help from Dr. Lynn Botts, who is here with us tonight. Dr. Botts' mother was suffering from dementia, and as we watched Lynn and Sandy caring for Jackie, we began to understand some things about dementia. And then as I was working on that chapter of this book, I had some discussions with Lynn about dementia. And Lynn and Sandy helped me to understand dementia a lot better than I had previously. And so there's resources that are provided for you so that you can work through all of these and related issues. So at this point, we're about at our break point, but I want to take time for any questions or any discussion. And if you have a question, I'm going to try and repeat the question so that it's on the video for our listeners later on. So any questions? So the question is, when you've got someone who's been caring for an elderly parent, either in your own home or in someone else's home, and you get to the point that you really can't handle it anymore, where you need to have help from a nursing home or a care facility, how does the church help that without making the person feel guilty or like a failure for putting their parent in a nursing home? Well, I think the church has to think through these issues a little more carefully and a little more deeply than we typically tend to do. There's an easy equation that says nursing homes are always warehousing. And if you're putting your loved one in a nursing home, you are forgetting about your loved one, you are turning your back on them, you are neglecting them, and you're a bad person. And that equation gets far too much traction, I think, in our circles. The reality of the fact is that people who are going through an aging process often have medical, physical needs that require specialized care. Care that is beyond the ability of most ordinary individuals to provide. And that care may need not just a specialist to come in, but a facility where that care can actually be given in a loving way. So, what is better to do? To kind of close your eyes, grit your teeth, and keep that loved one in a place where they are not getting adequate care, or finding a place where they can go, where they can get the care they need, and they are not being left to just gut it out. So, if the church is going to think more deeply about this, they need to look at specific cases and the specific requirements of the case, and not just make these blanket judgments that tend to hurt the caregiver who is trying their best and who has spent a lot of time and energy in trying to do what they think is right. Now, I used to be of the mindset that nursing homes were almost always bad. And it would be always much better, far superior, to have a parent in the home. But as I've talked to various people, I've started to realize that my thinking was rather simplistic and that I needed to go deeper into the actual situations. So let me give you just an example from Lynn and Sandy Botts. As they were caring for their mom, both Lynn and Sandy were working in the medical field. They couldn't be there 24/7. And because of the demands of their medical work, they oftentimes came home absolutely exhausted and with little energy for anything else. Now you might say, well, they should have just quit their jobs and cared for their mom at home. Well, then how do you pay the rent? And so they had to start making some hard choices. And they tried different options, and some of those options worked better than other options, and they came to a point of then bringing their mother back home for the last years of her life and working a situation where Sandy was not working as much. Lynn was basically the main breadwinner, so to speak. But to just say it's always this simplistic thing, one size fits all, don't bother me with details, is not very loving and kind to a caregiver who may be absolutely spent in this work. Lynn?
I also think it's important to recognize that when that difficult decision is made, the location.
And when a decision is made to use a facility, that kind of attention can actually protect the family member from neglect or abuse in the facility, where you're monitoring what's going on here and is my loved one being taken care of? And that's especially important when you're paying significant amounts of money to a facility to take care of your loved one. You have every right to say, are you doing what you've promised and what you're contractually obligated to do? Other questions or comments? Yeah, David?
I'm not making this argument myself, I don't think. But I can almost hear what I do. What are your thoughts?
So the question is, do we have freedom to utilize a care facility? Perhaps something that the parents have saved for, invested in, so that they can go to an assisted living facility, for instance. And I think absolutely they do. One thing I've learned, don't tell my parents I said this, but sometimes you can't tell your parents what to do. You can ask them, you can encourage them and advise them, but if they're still, decision-making adults, you don't have the authority or the capacity to say, no, Mom, here's what you're doing. And if they have spent their years investing in a care facility so that they can go there and live out their later years in that facility, who are we to say, no, you can't do that? We don't have that authority to tell them what they must and must not. They're not under our authority. Now, there's some times where parents are past their decision-making prime and may make some kind of foolish decisions. And there's a point where you say, I want to warn you about the wisdom or the folly of what you're about to do. But they can make that decision, and I don't think we stand in their way and say, thou shalt not. It's just not our place. David? Yeah. Our experience in nursing home ministry over the years has been quite shocking that there are quite a few of those elderly people who have no family that come visit them at all. Now, there are some who have a son or a daughter or a grandson or granddaughter who are there, once, twice, 3 times a week. But then there are others who don't even have any family living nearby. Maybe they've lived here and the rest of their kids are gone in other parts of the country, and so they just put them in that facility and they stay there. And I don't have statistics to tell you how widespread it is, but just anecdotally, I've seen it over and over again where people are saying, no, we never get visitors. And you notice how they brighten up when you come in, and especially if you have kids with you, and how they love seeing kids. Now, a Christian home like Pine Haven, I think, does tend to have a higher level of care and interest on the part of the family towards their elderly loved ones. But I think that the system in our country has become highly institutionalized. And we've moved away from a family model toward an institutional model, which has really done significant damage. Any other comments or questions? Yes, Nate.
I have a question. You mentioned this out of that conversation.
So the question is, what lessons have I learned in trying to help parents and their adult children in dealing with the hard decisions about maybe care facility or something of this sort? As a pastor, I find it very tempting to step in and try and solve their problems for them. And there's a sense of satisfaction and empowerment if I can solve your problem. But it really is important for the families to wrestle through the issues and make decisions that everybody can live with. And so rather than coming in as the shall answer man, I rather come in as someone to facilitate a discussion to help them reach a conclusion that they can agree on. Now, sometimes that's not possible because you can have stubbornness on the part of the elderly parent or the adult child or both. And sometimes one side or the other will dig in their heels and just be unworkable. And I'm sorry, the best pastor in the world is not going to be able to overcome that kind of entrenched stubbornness. But rather than jumping to say, here's what you should do, I want to come in and say, let's talk about this situation and where things are at and what the opinions and perspectives and desires are of all parties. And let's try to see if we can work together towards some level of consensus. And in a perfect world, you get it, and it's there all the time. But in the world that we inhabit, sometimes you just don't get there. And so I'd love to say, here's the gold-plated answer that will solve every situation. These are interpersonal matters, and interpersonal matters are always challenging. And as older people sometimes get more entrenched in their opinions and hold on very tightly to their sense of autonomy, and as adult children look at that with growing frustration, it can be a recipe for just a garbage dump fire where it gets really bad. And then you just use your pastoral skills as best you can to point people to Christ, to point people to their Christian duty, to appeal to them to love each other, and to work together towards agreement, if at all possible. We're going to take a quick break, and then we'll come back and talk a bit about the church and its ministry. Well, we're going to do a second installment here, focusing not so much on individual responsibilities as upon our responsibilities as a church. This is the church as a body, the church as an institution. And so what is the responsibility of the church in these matters? And I want to revisit just one of the verses from 1 Timothy 5 that I had read earlier. This is verse 16. If any woman who is a believer has dependent widows, she must assist them, and the church must not be burdened, so that it may assist those who are widows indeed. Now that statement, I think, recognizes certain limitations within the church. The church has limitations in financial resources for helping the needy. When there are widows or widowers who have financial needs, sometimes those needs can be substantial. And the church just does not simply have the resources to provide financial help to everyone who could need or use help. The church also has limitations in manpower for attending to the needy. Someone has got to spend time working with and helping those who are needy. And everybody's busy, everybody has demands on their time, and so the church doesn't have this unlimited vault of time and energy and manpower to give assistance to everyone who might need assistance. The church also has limitations in expertise in addressing the situations of the needy. So if there is a person in the congregation who is going through, let's say, severe depression, and that depression may have some clinical aspects to it, it's not necessarily the case that you've got a whole raft of people in the church who are equipped to intelligently deal with advanced clinical depression. And certain situations do demand expertise. Now, if you want me to do brain surgery on you, I'll try my best, but I can't guarantee much. Because I've never studied brain surgery, I've never even watched brain surgery, but I'm sure there's a YouTube video that I could find that would get me up to speed. But do you really want me doing brain surgery on you? I don't think so. And so the shortage of expertise. And then kind of a connected thing, the church has limitations in terms of qualified men who are willing to serve as deacons. I don't know too many churches in the OPC that have an overabundance of deacons. In some churches, they have no deacons. And when there are no deacons, the duties of the diaconate then fall to the elders. But it's not like we've got men who are just coming out of the woodwork to say, ooh, I'd like to be a deacon. I'm gifted, I'm qualified, I'm called. Can I please be a deacon? And so we have to live within our limitations. And we can't pretend like we have unlimited financial resources, unlimited manpower, unlimited expertise, and unlimited deacons to serve. Now, this has historically been true, and we find a case in point in Acts chapter 6, the opening of that chapter, where the Hellenistic widows were being neglected in favor of the Hebrew widows in the daily distribution of food. And that matter caused certain dissension and distress within the church and for the apostles. And the apostles felt like they were overworked already and that they really needed to devote themselves to the ministry of the word and prayer. They couldn't wait on tables. And so the fact that there were people being neglected, people falling through the cracks, and the complaints that came out of that just show that the church is not always fully stocked. It sometimes deals with these limitations. And part of the reason that I bring this up is because of a distinction that is made in this verse, in verse 16. It talks about dependent widows and those who are widows indeed. So a dependent widow is a widow that has a family support network. She has children. She has grandchildren. And those family members are the first line of care for her. They have a duty, an obligation, and a debt to pay to their mother or grandmother. But then you also have widows who are widows indeed. And I think what Paul means here are widows who have no children or grandchildren to provide for them and care for them. And these true widows, or widows indeed, have different conditions and different needs. And they need to be handled in a different manner. So when you have widows who have families to provide support and care, you want to be careful that you don't ignore the family, step in, and usurp the proper roles and rightful responsibilities of the family. You want to make sure that the family has plenty of room to operate because that is their obligation. And you don't want to step in and say, we're going to push you aside, we'll take care of this. We're the church. We do this sort of thing. So you just go off and keep yourself busy. We'll be the experts here. But rather the church has to say, look, this particular widow has a daughter and several granddaughters, and we are going to let them do what they're supposed to do. We're going to encourage them to take care of their aging parents. We also, as we deal with the situation with widows who have family support, we want to teach believers how to relate to those who are older than they are. And this is really pointed out in the first verses of chapter 5. Do not sharply rebuke an older man, but rather appeal to him as a father, to the younger men as brothers, the older women as mothers, and the younger women as sisters in all purity. So the church needs to be teaching its people how to relate to older and younger, and especially how to care for their family members. And so rather than stepping in and saying, we'll do this for you, we're saying, we're going to teach you about your obligation. We're going to encourage you and equip you in carrying out your duty because it is your duty before God. So we encourage and we exhort the children and the grandchildren to practice piety and to make some return to their parents. It's not bad to say to a member of your church, you know, your parents took care of you when you were little. They spent a lot of time, energy, and attention on your care when you were a little tiny child. Isn't it about time that you pay them back and do for them some kindness to repay them for all of the kindness they showed to you? Now, I know, I'm sure you see this too, the spirit of our age is a spirit of obsessive selfishness. It's all about me and my experience and whether or not I'm happy and fulfilled or not. And if I'm not happy and fulfilled, well, then the world is just not right. And people turn inward and they focus on self and they become obsessed with their own experience. And they can't look outward and care for those who are in need, who are right under their nose. And so we need to challenge the selfishness and encourage people to think more about serving their family than they think about being served themselves. Because this is simply the model that our Lord Jesus Christ gave us, that he did not come to be served, but to serve and give his life as a ransom for many. Now, we're not dying on the cross to atone for the sins of our parents, but we can certainly be focused upon them and their care, and we can encourage our people to look outward at serving others instead of being served themselves. And so if we have children or grandchildren that are within our own churches, we need to train and teach them to care for their own family. Now, sometimes it's the case where you have the older family, the aging parents in the church, and the children are not in the church, maybe not even in the community. But there are also some times where we have the children or the grandchildren in the church and the elderly parents are not there or they're elsewhere. Now, sometimes you have both and. Sometimes you have 3 generations within a single church, and that's really a blessed thing. But if we have young people whose parents maybe live in another area or attend another church or aren't even Christians at all, we can be equipping those young people to think intergenerationally and be serving and caring for their aging parents. So we handle those widows who have support in a particular way, but for the widows who are widows indeed, it's a different ballgame. And in this passage, it talks about honoring them. Verse 3, honor widows who are widows indeed. Treat them with respect and dignity. View them as weighty. They do not have children or grandchildren who are honoring them. So the church then honors them. The church becomes an extension, as it were, of the family in showing honor, respect, and love to them. And really valuing those dear widows and their place in the life of the church. We also need to understand their kind of unique situation, and this is spoken of in verse 5. Now she who is a widow indeed and who has been left alone has fixed her hope on God and continues in entreaties and prayers night and day. So she is a widow indeed. She's been left alone. That means that there are times where she is lonely, especially when there are holidays where families are getting together and she sits home alone with no place to go. Sundays can be very lonely days because she goes to church, but she doesn't have anybody to sit with. Her birthday comes and goes, and nobody even sends her a card. She has nobody around her. Well, we need to understand how lonely life can be for a widow who doesn't have children or grandchildren. And we can do what we can do to compensate for that, to try and say, look, we care about you. We'll have you over to the house. We'll spend time with you. We'll come over on your birthday and bring you a birthday cake. We'll do things to help you so that you do not feel isolated. She has also fixed her hope on God, and this is obviously talking about a Christian widow. I think about Anna, who spent so much time in the temple and was such a prayer warrior and got to see the infant Christ. And so you have these godly Christian widows who have fixed their hope on God. And so they continue in entreaties and prayers night and day. Oftentimes these older saints can be tremendous prayer warriors. And their ministry to the church is a ministry of prayer for the church. You know, sometimes older people say, why am I still here? What good can I do? What place do I have? What role do I fill? And I don't think it's trite to say, you know what? You can be a prayer support for your pastor, for your elders, for the families in your church, for visitors, for everybody in the life of the church. Your place may be spending entreaties night and day before God. And that's something that someone who is very enfeebled and crippled can still do. Even if they can't get out of their bed, they can still pray. And those appeals to God can be greatly used. I have a friend who has been a friend for many years, and he's pushing toward 80. And he's been sending me texts on Sundays praying for your ministry. And it has meant so much to me. And so often when I feel that I have had special freedom and power in the pulpit, it's one of those days where I get a text from my friend. And God hears and answers the prayers of his people. and the elderly can pray. And it's a tremendous ministry that they can have. As we deal with them, we need to prescribe and teach these things to them. And in verse 7 it says, prescribe these things as well, so that they may be above reproach. Now that's talking not only, I think, to the widow who gives herself to wanton pleasure and is dead even while she lives, but it's also true of the godly widow who is praying night and day. And so they need to be taught and encouraged in the things of the faith. There's one more thing in this passage which I think is curious and valuable. And Paul picks up on this in verses 9 and 10, where he talks about putting a widow on the list. And there's some good debate on what that exactly means, what this list was all about. I find the insights of Dr. George Knight to be particularly helpful. In his commentary, he says, so a church may have a list of elderly and godly widows who have no one else to care for them and who commit themselves to serving Christ. The church commits itself to assist these widows and in turn may ask them to perform certain tasks as the need arises. Noting all the dimensions of this arrangement keeps one from drawing the false conclusion that the church does not help other widows who are either younger or who do not fully meet the requirements. But the passage does imply that the church enters into this permanent arrangement only with certain qualified widows and with mutually accepted commitments and possible responsibilities. Noting all the dimensions of the arrangements also guards against the erroneous conclusion that Paul is mandating a widows' organization in the church. The teaching of the passage is, rather, that the church only provides for widows when families do not. Thus, where every widow is provided for by her family, there is no need for such a list. If, however, there needs to be a list, these are the requirements. So you've got one category of widows who are supported and cared for by their families. And so their children and grandchildren take care of them. They're not under consideration. Then you've got these other widows who have no means of support. And you're going to try and provide for them as best as the church can. Within this second category, there is a narrower category of these women who meet certain requirements. They're not over 60. They've done this, that, and the next thing. They've proven themselves through selfless ministry to others. You could possibly put them on the list. And the list becomes something of a core of widows who are able to help in certain situations with certain types of ministry, and in exchange for their participation in this type of ministry, the church is going to make sure they're well taken care of. There can be a financial agreement. You're spending 10 hours a week doing this sort of ministry, and we're going to be paying you to help you meet your financial needs. Now, I think Knight is right. This doesn't have to be the case, and in certain situations, it may not even be possible. Maybe you don't have any widows in this category. Maybe there are no widows that are in need in that category. So it's not a mandate that you've got to have this widows organization in every OPC church everywhere. But just saying, in certain situations, this sort of thing can be enormously helpful. Just today, I was putting one of our widows through her paces. We had a committee meeting at our church this afternoon, and I was under the gun to get everything done, and I had to turn to Ellen and say, could you do this and this and this? And, oh, and by the way, could you do that and that and that? And she did it all. She did it well. She made the committee meeting move through very smoothly. It was very helpful to me. So having these qualified widows to serve in this narrow and focused capacity can be a great benefit and blessing to the church. You know, one of the things that our society does, which I don't like, is to say, as you get older, you get more useless. But in my opinion, as people get older and gain more and more experience and more wisdom, they at least have the capacity of being more and more useful because they've learned so much through their years of experience. And if you've got a well-qualified widow who has a tremendous track record of godly conduct and service to others, why not use her in the ministry of the church, especially maybe to younger women who need a mature, godly influence like that? Now, let's be perfectly plain and clear for the video cameras. We are not talking about a different office. We're not talking about an ordained position. We're not talking about teaching authority over men in the church or anything of that sort. That's not the point. The point is more of service that they are especially fitted and experienced for, where they can be of great use. And the benefit to the church is also a benefit to them because they are being remunerated for their service to the church. So as we look at these widows indeed, they do have a rightful claim to the care and attention of their church. They should be ministered to, they should be treated with special care and deference. They should be looked after materially, and they should be cared for spiritually. And yes, if they're under 60 and meet the qualifications, put them on the list. But whether or not they're on the list, we want to take care of them and see them flourishing in a role of service in the church. Now, I think this focus on these widows indeed give us maybe a little bit of a picture of how we look at and care for aging parents. And we see them as a very valuable and important part of the congregation. And even though they may not be as spry and mobile as they used to be, they're still very valuable, deeply important to the church. And as we grow to appreciate them, and as we care for them, the benefits flow in all sorts of directions. Now, let me touch one other area, and then we'll take a few more questions and wrap up for tonight. As we think about ministering to adult children and aging parents, we need to really think in terms of cultivating covenant community. And what I mean is that there is a community life that we can have in the church that enables us as a body to minister to all sorts of people with all sorts of needs. And our covenant community life touches adult children who are being tugged in 1,000 different directions. It touches elderly parents who are struggling in their lives. It touches the widows. So let me tell you just a little bit about how this worked out at Grace Church in Sheboygan. I began to realize, and this was probably 13 years ago, that we had a startling number of people in our congregation who had aging relatives, older parents. And as I would talk with them, as I would listen to them, as we would visit them in their homes, we started to realize each one of them had a burden. And they were bearing that burden somewhat in isolation from others. And, as a pastor, I got to see the bird's eye view of this family, that family, that family, this couple. And I could see what was going on in all their lives, and I started to realize, very much they're having similar experiences. And they're all going through this thinking that nobody knows, nobody understands, maybe nobody cares. So that's when I got the bright idea of doing an adult Sunday school class on this. And I went into the class thinking that I wanted to mainly facilitate discussion. Now, I did provide some of the biblical groundwork. We looked at the Fifth Commandment. We looked at biblical examples. We looked at some of the New Testament passages. But then we started talking about things like caring for elderly parents in their retirement years, when they're still pretty active, pretty able to do everything for themselves, but they're past their vocational life and they're into the retirement life. And then we talked about what do we do when aging parents start experiencing illness, sometimes serious illness. And what does it mean when you have to set aside 2/3 of your day to go to a doctor's appointment with Dad and write everything down so you make sure that you've got a record of what the doctor told them? We had some very interesting and profitable class discussions on dementia and Alzheimer's, and what it looks like, and how it makes adult children feel when their parents can no longer recognize them or know their name. We talked about funerals. How do you handle when an aging parent dies? We talked about finances. What happens when your parents outlive their retirement assets? And as we had these little class discussions, I was watching something beautiful happen within our congregation. People were connecting with each other, and they were beginning to realize, oh, they're going through the same thing I'm going through. I'm not alone. And there are other people who have been down this road before who have some experience and some wisdom to help me. And there was kind of this cross-pollination that started really happening. And for that portion of the adult Sunday school class, I was just watching and listening and throwing in a comment here or throwing out a question there, and just watching this discussion kind of taking a life of its own. And as a result of that class, the members of our congregation were better equipped to share in each other's struggles, to weep with those who weep and rejoice with those who rejoice. So that when one of the elders' mother in her dementia started doing naughty things, like taking the kitchen sprayer and filling the living room with water, other members of the congregation came alongside of Mark and said, yeah, we went through that too. We know what you're experiencing. We know how you're feeling. And here's what we did. When Mark then had to make the difficult decision to put his mother in a facility and have her medicated because she had grown uncontrollable, he agonized over that. But people in the congregation again came alongside and said, you know what? Yeah, we were there too, and that is a really hard decision. And there was this body life going on amongst the members of the church that frankly had very little to do with me as the pastor. I was watching them ministering to each other and encouraging each other and helping each other. It was thrilling to see the kind of interaction that was going on. And that has continued and still continues even to this very day. In the last several months, we've had several members of our congregation who have lost parents who have passed away. And some of them after a long battle with either illness or dementia. And seeing our congregation showing up at the visitation at the funeral home and really reaching out and caring for and extending has continued to impress me that here you've got the covenant community being the covenant community of people who are bearing each other's burdens in love and thus fulfilling the law of Christ. And so you've got to think about how do we cultivate a covenant community consciousness within our congregation so that people will be equipped to serve one another in their various needs. And sometimes I'll say to people, as you're going through this hard situation that you're facing, remember that God puts us through such things so that we can be a comfort and help to others in the future. So even as you experience the struggle right now, and think about the difficulty you're under, think about it in terms of lessons you can learn that you can pass on in the future to someone who will be in the very same situation you're in. And as people kind of get a vision for this, as they think about this, and as they begin doing it, they find that it is very exciting and thrilling to be ministering in this way one to another. Ministry doesn't have to be and shouldn't be all top down, always done only by the pastor. Oh, we'll make an exception. An elder can occasionally do a little ministry too. Because look, pastors are professionals. They go to school for this and they get paid for it. So pastors should do all the ministry all the time. And elders get their chance every once in a while. We are to be equipping the saints for the work of service. And that means helping them to grow to the point where they can independently minister without me having to look over their shoulder and tell them what to do. And as this goes on in the church, it can take on a life of its own, where there's a kind of vitality of ministry that's going on, where the leadership is just watching and rejoicing to see the members carrying out the work of the ministry. That's not to say pastors or elders are unimportant or they shouldn't do anything, but it's not just always all on us. We're trying to help the members to grow up into mature saints who carry on this kind of care. So I think I've gone way over my time, but let's take a little time for discussion. Any other questions? I saw John Hartley waving at me earlier.
I'll take that as a cue. This is a kind of a narrow question.
Well, I think those situations are so distinct to the individual And some of it depends on the quality of the relationship you have with your parent. If you have a good, open, trusting relationship with your parent, where you could say, Dad, we really need to talk about your driving and whether it's wise for you to continue. And if he's willing to say, you know what, I've been thinking about this too, and I'm ready to give you the keys. That's great. That's easy. But then there are some times where you know good and well, if you try and even broach the subject, they're going to say, over my dead body, you do not get my keys. I will drive until I die. And you just have to kind of assess, do I have enough trust and confidence with my parent that I can have that kind of discussion or not? Now, my brother, my sister, and I have been working together, very consciously trying to be a team. And as we've been trying to provide care and attention to my parents, we all realize that some topics are better handled by Greg. Sometimes it's better that I start the conversation. Sometimes it's better that our sister Amy do it. And sometimes you just have to say, well, who's the best equipped to do this? Who's going to have the most possibility of a positive, successful conversation? Hey, Amy, would you do this? Or, hey, I'll do this. And, this is, again, just judging dynamics and realizing, this child and this parent butt heads all the time. And so it's probably not wise for that child to ask that parent for the keys. But another child, who is the wonder child, may be able to take the keys and nobody notices. And so just trying to evaluate those dynamics, I would say. Well, I have kept you over long. You've been very attentive. Thank you so much for coming tonight, and thanks to the committee for having me. And encourage you, just as one final shameless plug, because I want to be known for my shameless plugs. If you have not done this already, think about the possibility of having an adult Sunday school class in your church using my book as your basis for discussion, and see if you can't have some of those same discussion dynamics that we had at Grace Church. Let's pray together. Father, we thank you for this time tonight, for a chance to think about some difficult, challenging, and important issues. And Lord, as we think about our own parents and even our own grandparents, we do pray that you would help us to keep the Fifth Commandment toward them, to honor them and love them, to respect them. And Lord, help us to especially offer care to those who are still with us in this world and who have need for our help. Lord, give us a good night of rest and refreshment. Bless the day tomorrow as Presbytery meets. We pray that you would give the Presbytery wisdom in its deliberations, and that you would prosper all of the presbyters, especially those who are still traveling or who will be traveling tomorrow morning. We ask it in Jesus' name. Amen.